Hello again, this is Randy Skelton for Intro to Biological Anthropology, and this is Lecture 2, The History of Evolutionary Thought. The goals for this lecture are, like the title implies, to investigate the history of evolutionary thought. Also, we want to understand that natural selection is the primary mechanism causing evolution. We'll see in coming lectures that it's certainly not the only mechanism of evolution, but we consider it the primary one because it's the only one that can actually adapt a species to its environment. So let's start with the concept of change. Really, that's all that evolution means, is change. And the concept that things in the world change, including natural species of animals and plants and so forth, goes back at least to the ancient Greeks. But there was kind of a monkey wrench thrown into it when the Romans adopted Christianity, where at that time Christianity was committed to the idea of fixity, and the Romans and those that came after them adopted that for many, many years, way more than 1,500 years. The idea of fixity is the idea that nothing changes, and if it does, it ends up worse than it was before. The idea of degeneration, that if any change occurs, it's a degeneration. It leads to a worse situation than what had existed before. Well, looking back on it now with the benefit of history and social theory and so forth, we know that fixity is a great political tool, especially for an empire that's somewhat, how do I want to say it, oppressive maybe is the way to say it, but it's poor science. However, people are not stupid for believing in fixity. There's a tendency to think, well, these people back long ago must have been completely stupid, but it's not a stupid idea. One thing, and I used to talk about this without actually having the experience behind it, but now that I'm kind of older, I realize that older people romanticize the past. And I often look back to when I was a kid, back in the late 1950s, early 60s, on into the 70s, and, things seemed great then. There weren't as many people around, etc. But so many things have gotten better since then. I mean, we've got the internet now. You've got a telephone you can carry around in your pocket, which I think is a basic safety feature. And so objectively, the world has gotten better, but older people tend to romanticize the past. I find myself doing that. I think that's just part of human nature. Also, humans really don't live that long a time. 80 years, let's say, on average, and over that fairly short span of time, it has, throughout much of history, taken careful observation to notice that the world actually changes. In more recent times, I can definitely see a lot of change occurring over my lifetime, and you will be able to see it too, maybe even more than what I do. But back in the past, when things changed much more slowly, it did take careful observation to notice. And in fact, when you're looking at most things having to do with how the natural world operates, let's say erosion wearing down a mountain, That takes many generations to happen, and over the course of a human lifetime, you're probably not going to be able to notice that happening. Now, before the reemergence of evolutionary thought, which I'll get to in a moment, people did see an order to nature. Again, they were trying to organize things as best as they could, given, their cultural, religious situation at the time. And the way that they thought things were organized was according to a scala naturae, that means a staircase of nature, a ladder of nature, and a very similar concept, in fact probably exactly the same thing, is the great chain of being. And what they saw this is a progression from lower species which were further from God to higher species that were closer to God. So you start, let's say on this little graphic here, you start with worms that are very low, and then you might have dogs, and then monkeys, and then apes, and then man, quote unquote. And above man, closer to God, you would find angels, and then eventually God himself. And there are some things about that are not ridiculous. It is an ordering. In some things, in some ways, it does the things that we expect an ordering of nature to do, such as grouping together similar organisms like monkeys, apes, and man that are much more similar to each other than any of them are to a dog. It just wasn't the complete solution. We think of things much differently today. Now, the idea of fixity began to crumble in the early 1700s. In the early 1700s, we see really the last great proponent of fixity, and that was Linnaeus. Linnaeus developed the system of taxonomy that we still use today pretty much. I'll talk about that in a coming lecture, though it too, here in the 21st century, is starting to be supplanted by kind of a different system. Also in the early 1700s, we had Buffon, who was an early proponent of change, of evolution. He said that change occurs, and it occurs according to natural laws, but didn't actually specify these natural laws. He kind of thought it might have something to do with the environment, but wasn't too clear about it. And so we credit him with the idea of change, but in sort of a vague way, let's say. When we move on to the late 1700s, we see the last real scientific battles between the fixity people, let's call them creationists, those people that believe that God created everything a certain way, and all changes since then, if there have been any changes at all, have been degenerations. By the late 1700s, creationists were beginning to encounter a problem because of the fossil record. Fossils were being discovered that showed that some species had gone extinct. And extinction is a change. Maybe you can consider it a degeneration kind of change, but it's change nonetheless. And so we had Cuvier proposed the theory of catastrophism based on the Bible. He said that Earth was shaped by a series of catastrophes, the most recent of which was Noah's flood, as recorded in the book of Genesis and the Bible, and that extinct animals are extinct now because they didn't make it onto Noah's Ark, for some reason or another. Now, fairly contemporary with Cuvier was Lamarck, who was a proponent of evolution. And he went a step farther than Buffon had before him. He correctly noted that evolution occurs as a response to the environment, but he didn't have the right mechanism. He incorrectly hypothesized that evolution occurs by inheritance of acquired characteristics. So, what does that mean? Well, at one level, it means that, if somebody has their appendix removed, that their children would be born without an appendix. And we know right off the bat that's not true. Lots of people have had their appendix removed and their children are born with a perfectly good appendix. So we know that this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics is not true. And it's easy to refute with that example of appendix removal. The classic sort of expression of Lamarck's ideas, though it's not clear to me that Lamarck himself actually proposed this, was the idea of the giraffe's neck becoming long as they would stretch their neck to reach for leaves high in a tree, that their necks would stretch, and so their offspring would be born with longer necks. Now, I don't want to go completely overboard in ruling out Lamarckian type inheritance. We'll come back in a later lecture and show there are some mechanisms that lead to a Lamarckian type of inheritance, but it's not this in this way. This is not the driving force behind evolution of species. In fact, I'll say it right now, we know that there is a limited form of Lamarckian inheritance of acquired traits that comes from what we call epigenetics. Epigenetics refers to the condition of DNA, we call it states of DNA, meaning that some genes are turned on and others are turned off. And it's known that DNA can be passed from parents to offspring in a certain state, having certain genes turned on and others turned off. And to the extent that these DNA states can be acquired by an individual during their lifetime, they can be passed on to their children. So there is a very limited form of Lamarckian inheritance that we do recognize today. Now also, in the late 1700s, we had Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather. I'll get to Charles in a moment, but he was a proponent of evolution as well. And we had Hutton, who was a geologist, that refuted Cuvier's catastrophism, the idea that the Earth was shaped by great catastrophes in the past. Now, Hutton didn't deny, in fact, nobody would deny that there are catastrophes that happen in the world. There are volcanoes, there are floods, there are various things that happen in the natural world that cause the Earth to be changed and shaped, but these are normal in an ultimate sense. You don't have to have the great Noah's flood. You can have normal floods that happen every 100 years or every 1,000 years that can accomplish the same sorts of things. So Hutton proposed the idea that the Earth was shaped by forces that are still operating now, and so we can understand those forces. So that idea that the Earth is shaped by forces still operating today is known as uniformitarianism. And Charles Lyell, who was Hutton's student, really formalized and promoted this idea of uniformitarianism. Again, the idea that the forces that shaped the Earth in the past are the same ones operating today. And what this implies is that the Earth is very old. Cuvier, with his catastrophism, thought the Earth was maybe 6,000 years old. Well, Lyell thought it was maybe 1,000,000 years old. Wow, that's really old. We know today that they were both wrong, that the Earth is actually somewhere around 4.5 billion years old. So the Earth does have a very long history indeed, and this is demanded by the idea of uniformitarianism. Also, let's move on to the early 1800s, where we had Malthus, who was a demographer. Demography is, at least back at that time, part of the field of economics, but it's about birth and death of individuals, population growth rates, population decline rates, and so forth. And in his study of those things, Malthus observed that of all individuals ever born, only a few survived to reproduce. So we can see this with humans as well, that, you know, some people die, and they die young. They die as infants or die as children without reproducing, so that of all individuals ever born, only some of them survive to reproduce. Malthus said a few, and, well, what does a few mean? The point is that not everybody born survives to reproduce and have children of their own. Now, Darwin put together these ideas. He combined the ideas in particular from Lamarck, Lyell, and Malthus, who of course had people standing behind them. You know, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. You all know that idea. Darwin took from Lamarck the idea that species evolve. He took from Lyell and his uniformitarianism the idea that evolution is kind of uniformitarian too, that not only geology but biological evolution, these changes occur due to things that we can see happening in the world today over long time spans. And he combined these ideas with the idea of Malthus, that of all individuals born, not all of them survive to reproduce. And he came up with the idea of natural selection. So natural selection goes like this. If some inherited factor promotes survival or fertility, then the individuals who have it produce more offspring. Thus, that advantageous inherited factor becomes more common in the next generation. So, again, we're assuming there's some inherited factor, something genetic, that promotes survival, the ability to survive, and fertility, the ability to have offspring. Well, individuals who have that inherited factor will survive longer, and that allows them to have more offspring and more fertile, so they have more offspring. And those individuals that lack this factor are not going to survive as long nor be as fertile, and so we'll have fewer offspring. And then when you look at that next generation, those children, those offspring of those individuals that had that advantageous gene predominate. There are more of them. And so that gene has become more common in the population. This is a perfectly mechanistic mechanism, meaning that it just works automatically. You don't have to have anything special occurring for it to work, and in fact, it's hard to imagine how it wouldn't work. Now, here are some illustrations showing kind of a classic example of selection and how it can relate to the environment. So before the Industrial Revolution in Europe, these peppered moths would hang around trees that were kind of light colored, and notice that these light colored peppered moths are kind of camouflaged, and these dark colored peppered moths really stand out. But after the Industrial Revolution and people are burning large quantities of coal and so forth to produce steam to run engines at factories, the trees became coated with soot and became darker in color. And now, who stands out? It's the light-colored peppered moths, and the dark-colored peppered moths are more camouflaged. So before the Industrial Revolution, who had the advantage? Well, the light-colored peppered moths, because of their camouflage, and after the Industrial Revolution, the dark-colored ones had the advantage. And so what do you expect happened to the ratio of light versus dark-colored moths after the Industrial Revolution? That's right, the darker ones became more common. Darwin talked about fitness. He said that natural selection favors individuals with greater fitness. In fact, you may have heard the term survival of the fittest, which is actually really kind of a bad expression, but Darwin himself used it, and he did talk about fitness. So what is fitness? First, it's nothing like what we think of as fitness in 21st century America, where when we say, oh, that person's fit, we mean it's something about their strength, their endurance, their competitive, their advantage, not being too overweight, something like that. But Darwin defined it as being the combination of survival and fertility, and measured it by the number of offspring. So the more offspring an individual has, the more fit they are in Darwin's terms. And so an example of that is the most fit female so far thought to exist, though this is kind of a story that we don't really know whether it's true or not, but supposedly there was a Russian woman that lived in the 1800s called Mrs. Vassilette, who had 69 kids. Now think about that. Now she didn't have 69 separate births. She had, according to this story anyway, several twins, triplets, and so forth. But still, that's a lot of kids and a lot of births. How strong do you think she was after going through that? How fit in our modern American sense do you think she was? Well, probably, I would guess that she had severe health problems. But Darwin would consider her, in terms of Darwinian fitness, very fit, the most fit female, because of having all those children. Now, fitness does depend on the environment, as we saw with that peppered moths example. And we see this all over the place. We notice that in the Arctic, dogs have thick hair, but in the tropics they have little or no hair. Their hair is very short. We notice that humans have dark skin near the equator, where sunlight is strong and ultraviolet radiation. But near the poles, where ultraviolet is weaker, they have light skin. Now, we need to talk about Alfred Russel Wallace as well, who discovered natural selection at about the same time as Darwin. And we want to be fair to everybody. Now, why is Darwin usually given the credit, or at least more credit? It's because he had amassed a huge amount of evidence in support of his theory, but Wallace was still kind of in the beginning stages at that time. He had the idea, but hadn't amassed the huge amount of evidence that Darwin had. Darwin published his famous book titled On the Origin of Species in 1859, which presented compelling evidence that natural selection was the primary mechanism causing evolution. Again, it's not the only mechanism. We'll approach that topic later, but the main mechanism, and actually the only mechanism that can adapt an organism to its environment. Now, there were a lot of things Darwin didn't know, like all great scientists. Darwin didn't know everything, and many things have been discovered since his time. For one thing, Darwin didn't know very much about inheritance. He had an idea of how inheritance worked, but it was the wrong idea, a strange idea. Inheritance, the principles of inheritance, didn't become widely known until around the year 1900. Well, Darwin was working in the late 1800s, so he couldn't know about this yet. Darwin didn't know anything about DNA. DNA was discovered in 1954, almost 100 years after Darwin, so he couldn't know about that. There were certain things about behavior that really stumped him, especially the type of behavior called altruism, where some individual does some act that actually decreases their fitness, decreases their survival or fertility for the benefit of some other individual that gets an increase in fitness, an increase in survival or fertility. That's defined as altruism, and Darwin couldn't explain that very well. That remained for people in the 1960s, actually, more than 100 years after Darwin, to come up with the answer to that. And Darwin didn't completely understand rates of evolution. He assumed, again following Hutton and Lyell's uniformitarian principle, that things had to occur very slowly and gradually. But by the 1970s, again more than 100 years later, it had become obvious that the fossil record says that evolution goes in fits and starts. It's not a gradual, always occurring at the same rate type of process, and we will talk more about that in a coming lecture as well. In the interest of being fair to everybody, we should point out that actually Darwin wasn't really the first person to come up with the idea of natural selection. Since 2017, historians of science have shown pretty clearly that back in the AD 800s, around AD 800, there was a Muslim scholar named Al-Jahiz from what is today Iraq who wrote the Book of Animals. Darwin didn't know about this. In Darwin's time, people just weren't paying attention to ancient Muslim scholars from 1,000 years earlier. But Al-Jahiz described a natural selection process arising from competition between individuals. He also described adaptation to environmental conditions, and we need to acknowledge that he had these ideas 1,000 years before Darwin did. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about evolution, and I'd like to illustrate some of the modern misconceptions about evolution by asking a series of questions. If time runs short, I may not get to them all, but in this online version of the class, I'll try to speed it up and make sure that I do. So, question number 1. The idea that evolution has occurred is a fact, not a theory. True or false? And then we'll follow that with the question, Darwin's idea that natural selection is the primary mechanism causing evolution is a fact, not a theory. True or false? So, think about that. You can pause the video if you want, but the answer number 1 is true. Evolution is a fact, meaning that it's an observation that species have changed through time. There's nothing theoretical about this. We can tell it from the fossil record and in living forms. So evolution is a fact. But the idea that evolution proceeds by natural selection is a theory. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not likely to be true. In fact, the theory of evolution by natural selection is, just like other long-standing theories, Einstein's theory of relativity, for example, which seem to be true so far as we can tell, but someday evidence might emerge that one of these theories, such as the theory of evolution by natural selection, is false for some reason or under some conditions. That's the way science works. So one thing I can point to is that there are times and places where some mechanism other than natural selection is more important than natural selection is. For example, in modern 21st century America, gene flow is much more important as an evolutionary mechanism than natural selection. So there are times, conditions, places, situations where the theory of evolution by natural selection can be shown to be false. Okay, question 2. Darwin was the first to propose that species evolve. True or false? You already know that's false, that idea goes back to the ancient Greeks, and then we've got Al-Jahiz in there, and then we've got, Buffon and so forth, Lamarck in there, who are all before Darwin. Question 3. Evolution always involves a competitive struggle for existence. True or false? This is false. And this is something that we like to think about. Even scientists in the 21st century have this sort of underlying idea that natural selection involves a competition of some sort. And certainly competition is common in nature, and there are some situations in which there are winners and losers for sure with regard to natural selection. But there's also plenty of situations where there's cooperation. And so while competition is common, cooperation is common too, perhaps equally common. And so natural selection does not always involve some competition. Question 4. Individuals evolve. True or false? That's another false one. Although natural selection acts on individuals, meaning that it's individuals that either live or die, individuals that either reproduce or fail to reproduce. When we talk about evolution, we're actually looking at a population or a species. We're not looking at individuals. Individuals certainly change over their lifetime. You know, I'm a lot different now than I was when I was, say, 20. I'm over 60 now. And I look different. I act different. Blah-de-blah-de-blah. But you can't describe that as evolution. It's just natural age-related change. It's not anything particularly about my genes that have changed. It's really tough to change your genes from those that you inherited from your parents. So natural selection doesn't act on individuals, it acts on populations. And since a species is a population, we say that it acts on species as well. Question 5. Humans lived at the same time as dinosaurs. True or false? And then going along with that, the ancestors of humans lived at the same time as dinosaurs. True or false? Okay. False. Dinosaurs did not live at the same time as humans. Dinosaurs became extinct about 65, 66 million years ago. Something that we would call a human didn't appear until 7 million years ago, and that's giving a pretty loose definition of human. Modern humans like us, and this is still kind of a loose definition, didn't appear until about 300,000 years ago. But the idea that the ancestors of humans lived with dinosaurs is true. Humans must have had some ancestor that lived before 65 million years ago. For example, we have a fossil species called Purgatorius found here in Montana, dating to about 70 million years ago, which is likely to have been an ancestor of humans. And so, true, humans must have had some ancestor that lived along with dinosaurs. Question 6. All living organisms are evolutionarily related to each other. Let me say that again clearly. All living organisms are evolutionarily related to each other. True or false? This one's true. Assuming that life arose only once, which seems really, really likely, all living organisms are descended from the first living thing and are therefore evolutionary relatives. Question 7. Humans are descended from chimpanzees. True or false? And follow that up with humans are descended from apes. True or false? Okay. This is kind of a definitional question. Okay. False. Humans and chimpanzees shared an ancestor that was neither a human nor a chimpanzee. That ancestor is likely to have been similar to a fossil that we have called Oranopithecus. Oranopithecus has the features that we would expect for the ancestor that was shared by both chimpanzees and humans. But chimpanzees did not evolve from humans, nor did humans evolve from chimpanzees. Now, the second part of this is humans evolved from apes. True or false? True. Apes are catarrhine primates. We'll talk about what that means in another lecture. That have anatomical adaptations for brachiation. That means swinging by your arms in a tree. In fact, humans are apes. We fall into that category of apes. And we retain that anatomy of brachiation, the defining feature of an ape, and we must have inherited that from an ancestor that was an ape. And by the way, we are still apes. So that answer is true. Question 8, here's a subtle one. Humans are the most highly evolved organism. True or false? False. Humans are very specialized for certain things, like intelligence, that humans themselves value highly. In fact, all living organisms have an equally long evolutionary history, at least 3.5 billion years, and have their own specializations. To say that the human specializations are better somehow than, say, a jellyfish's specializations is really arrogant. Obviously, I'm a human and I value intelligence, but jellyfish, they might look at us and say, well, humans don't even have stingers on their tentacles. I mean, that makes them really low organisms. So the principle here is that we can't really judge things from our human point of view and say that those things that we have are the best. That's a fallacy of logic called ethnocentrism. So the answer to this question, are humans the most highly evolved organisms, is false. Question 9. There is only one species of human being living today. True or false? Follow that with, in the past, there's only been one species of human being living at any given time. True or false? Well, the answer to the first of these questions is true. All living people belong to single species, in fact the same subspecies, Homo sapiens sapiens, but this hasn't always been true. There are a number of examples of 2 or more human species at the same time in the past. One very clear example is modern people like ourselves and Neanderthals living together in the Middle East for about 30,000 years, between about 70,000 years ago and about 40,000 years ago. Question 10. Natural selection no longer operates in modern human populations. True or false? False. This is a common misconception. You hear the idea that modern medicine allows some people to live who, under other conditions, would probably die. So, therefore, natural selection no longer operates. But remember that natural selection is about survival, but it's also about fertility. And we also need to look at the fertility. And when we do that, it's observed that people with some genetic defect, whose lives are prolonged by modern medicine, have fewer children, and so are still less likely to pass on their genetic defect. That is natural selection. However, the effect of natural selection is less in modern populations, mostly because there are just so many humans living in the world today. A couple of months ago, we passed over the 8 billion human population mark, and that's a lot of people. Finally, the last of these questions. The course of evolution through time has inevitably led to the development of intelligent human beings. True or false? I think you would probably guess from things I've said before that this is false. Human evolutionary history has been a chain of improbable events. If any one of those events had not occurred, we wouldn't be the same as we are now. Now, it's impossible to rule out the possibility of a controlling intelligence, such as God, that's behind human evolution and leading it to develop the way that it has. You can't eliminate that possibility, but you don't need it necessarily. There's no scientific need to explain why humans are the way they are, but if you would rewind the history of the earth and play it again, there's no guarantee that something like humans would emerge. All right, that's it, and I'll see you next time.